Future, and welcome to our very badly misnamed seminar. They think it's all over. I'm Jill Rutzer. I'm the new Director of Strategy and Relationships at British Future. I've got some housekeeping announcements before we start. If there is a fire alarm, it means there's a real fire, and we need to evacuate the building through the door to the right and down the stairs. If you need bathrooms, they're down there past the lifts to the left. The doors are all open, and there are some loos on the floor above and below as well. So this morning we're going to kind of reflect on what happened, what this means for our politics over the next 3 months to party conferences, and also what are the long-term implications and how the big issues of the campaign around immigration and the economy are going to pan out. And we've got 3 speakers who are going to speak for about 5 minutes each, and then it's over to you for questions. And we're going to start thinking about Europe and what this means for our relationship with Europe and how our relationship with Europe will play out in terms of British politics. And I'd like to introduce Stephen Booth, the co-director of Open Europe.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about what the relationship with what it means for our relationship with Europe in the sort of short to medium term. I think others will touch on some of the domestic politics and how the sort of vote unfolded a bit more. Obviously, the first thing to sort of point out is that we are leaving. We haven't left yet, and the process for doing so, I think, could be quite complicated for many different reasons. I mean, the UK legally cannot be thrown out, so we can only leave once we notify our intention to leave under what's called the Article 50 process. And under the Article 50 process, that actually provides for negotiating a withdrawal agreement, which I think actually is distinct from what the next agreement with the EU might be. So there's the terms of our withdrawal, i.e. sort of tying up budget contributions, what it means for the institutions, and how we actually leave. But what actually comes after that is I would argue should be negotiated at the same time, but it is a separate issue. So I think, given the results, I think clearly, maybe the best thing that we can do now is take some time to reflect on what's happened and let things calm down a bit, both domestically and in Europe, because there's a lot of domestic politics that has to happen now. Obviously, I think people are going to talk more about that, but in terms of leadership election in the Tory party, possibly Labour Party, and maybe a general election. Well, that's obviously something that we don't know at this stage. I think obviously the EU response over the weekend has been slightly different from different places. So the EU institutions, and I think sort of the French president has sort of talked about the need to do it quickly, the need to get Article 50 process going in a quick time. Whereas Angela Merkel, for example, has sort of stressed the need to get this right, and actually maybe we need a bit more time to think about what the right response to this is. And I think that kind of dynamic, I think, will actually be quite important going forward. I think that there are certain member states who will be much more amenable when it comes to negotiating withdrawal. I think that the obvious countries that will be helpful, I think, are sort of Netherlands, Scandinavia, Germany, Eastern European member states. I think where the UK has a lot more sort of bargaining chips with. I think in terms of possibly France and some other southern European member states, and actually the EU institutions, we may find life a bit more difficult. And under Article 50 and the process for leaving, I mean, my assumption would be that we'd be negotiating a comprehensive agreement one way or the other, which will effectively need consent amongst all EU member states, not simply a qualified majority vote. So we're going to have to bear in mind we're going to have to get this through every national parliament around the EU. And we'll be negotiating with the EU institutions on a mandate from the national government. So there's lots of circles to square here. It's not just dealing with the European Commission and a majority of member states, it's dealing with the EU as a whole, their domestic electorates and the institutions as well. I think, given where we are, I think the best thing that the Leave campaigners or those emerging leaders from the Leave camp can do now is to reassure those people who feel that they might be most affected by this, so EU citizens here, UK citizens in the EU, perhaps make some symbolic efforts to sort of ensure that we maintain our cooperation in things like the European Health Insurance Card, Erasmus, things where we can sort of make an economic contribution to and to sort of maintain some of the benefits for citizens in the UK, but also citizens from the EU who are in the UK. But I think a lot more thought has to go into what happens next in terms of what is the UK negotiation strategy, what kind of relationship are we going for? Because in the work that Open Europe did before the referendum, one of the things that we made very clear was that we were neutral on the referendum itself, and we believe that the UK can succeed outside the European Union. But Brexit can't be all things to all people, and the range of promises that have been made to people in terms of leave, they can't all be fulfilled. There are going to be choices that are going to have to be made, there are trade-offs to be made. And the most obvious one, I think, is around immigration, free movement of people, and access to the EU market. Because the debate now, I think, will be about whether we stay in the single market, which effectively means accepting all the 4 freedoms, including free movement of people. But it does obviously, from a business point of view, mean the best in terms of continuity and access to markets. I think the problem with that from a UK point of view is that basically by doing that you've forfeited your say over the high politics, so you have no say over future treaty changes, you have no say over future enlargement. So I think the prospect of Turkey was always a misnomer, but if for example, that became the real issue, we could no longer veto Turkey, but we'd have to accept the consequences in terms of free movement of people. So I really think that's going to be very difficult to accept unless the EEA undergoes fundamental change, which is possible, but that's probably a very long-term project. So I think at the moment, all sort of indicators point to some kind of bespoke, comprehensive economic and other things agreement with the EU, which again I think will be complicated, but I think that will have to centre on some aspect of control over free movement of people. And then the best access that you can negotiate in terms of goods and services. I think that negotiating goods access is relatively straightforward. There's no interest, I think, on either side to impose tariffs on goods. I think the area that is the most complicated is services, because that is the most complicated area in any trade agreement, let alone one that's going to be so as politically charged as this one. And I think financial services is the one area which is the most complex. Just a couple more things. I mean, I guess from the UK point of view, we have to also sort of look at what are the opportunities here, because this is a result I think we're going to have to live with. So how do we make the best of this? So I think the 2 areas that you have to look at are trade agreements with the rest of the world. What gives you the greatest flexibility to do that? I think, again, tying yourself into the European Economic Area does actually limit your ability somewhat, because Norway can do its own trade agreements, but it can only really offer things on goods and tariffs. Given that most trade agreements now are all about harmonising regulations and so on, if you accept the Norway option, you're basically binding yourself to the European system of regulation, and that gives you less bargaining chips when going into deals with non-EU countries. So I think that's another thing we need to think about. And on that same sort of ballpark in terms of domestically, are there areas where we can get ourselves out of EU regulation, so and return that to domestic control, so things like environment, energy, labour law, where the UK could potentially benefit from some of that flexibility. I think it will need, outside the European Union, we are going to have to work harder for our economic growth, and we're going to need some of that flexibility, I think. And then lastly, I think the thing we have to really think long and hard about, and there has to be a domestic debate about this, is what are our negotiating chips? What are the things that we can potentially put on the table, that we'd be happy to put on the table to do a deal with the EU? And I think that the obvious area is around sort of defence, security, our sort of role as a sort of US aircraft carrier, or sort of linked to the US. That's something that I think that we have to think about using in terms of our deal with the EU, because I think it was the obvious deal to do if we were inside the EU, is that we offer more in terms of security, we get more market access, but in return for that we kind of gradually opted out of further political integration and further integration in areas that the UK is not as interested in. I think that's the deal that the obvious one to do outside, because I think from a sort of Eastern European point of view, I think there's a huge value in binding the UK into sort of Europe in the widest sense geopolitically, and if the rest of Europe wants to keep the US engaged with European security, the UK is the best bet for that as well. So I think those are the areas in which we have to consider what we can do. I think there's going to be some kind of economic contribution, again, whether that's through the EU budget or through, let's say, greater spending on European security. That might be another way of doing it. But I think all of this needs to be thought long and hard over. And as I said, the big issue now will be whether we stay in the single market, and that means accepting a lot of what people said they didn't like, or we go to something more bespoke, which I think does come with much more complicated negotiations probably, but I think in the long run probably gives the UK the flexibility that it needs to prosper outside of the EU. So that's where I would leave it at this stage.
Thank you very much. Lots to think about. We've got Ryan Shorthouse next, the director of Bright Blue, and I think Ryan is going to talk about what happens next in relation to the Conservative Party.
Okay, thank you very much, Jill. And obviously, I predicted a Remain victory, so I'm still in a bit of a state of shock. And of course, I think politics at the moment is very much in a state of flux, and there's a lot of anger, particularly from the Remain side, about what's happening. And politics is moving very quickly. So I caveat my words with, anything can happen in the next few months politically, and already surprising things are happening, not least the resignation of the Prime Minister. And the focus of the newspapers and debate at the moment seems to be very much on internal party politics, both within the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. But the government as it exists now, with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister in place, will be doing all they can, I think, to take measures to prop up the economy and show that Britain is open for business. And you would have seen that this morning in the Chancellor's statement. And there's been a lot of criticism from people in the Conservative Party about where has the Chancellor gone over the weekend. But actually, I think it's quite right that he hasn't engaged in political leadership questions, but instead is focused on the economic strategy and making sure that necessary measures are taken to make sure that we mitigate some of the impact of the shock that we're now going through. What Cameron and Osborne are going to do, I expect there'll be some fiscal measures. Osborne has talked about a budget, an emergency budget, but I expect the tone of that to be very much that we're open for business, and I wonder whether there'll be measures around corporation tax and fiscal measures to really provide a boost and an inward investment to Britain, and I expect as well the Bank of England to take monetary policy decisions, particularly around interest rates. But I think the narrative from the government that exists, which will be going on in the background of political debate, will be very much taking measures to ensure we have inward investment and businesses still find the UK an attractive place to do business. But of course, in the foreground will be the leadership contest, where I expect Cameron will definitely not play a role in that, but I expect also Osborne will not play a role and be instead focusing on his role as Chancellor. I think the leadership contest will be a wide field. It is already. People like Nicky Morgan and George Freeman have said they will do it. A lot of those people will not be expecting to win, but it's often quite a good move to put yourself in a leadership contest because you thrust yourself onto the centre stage and you become that kind of big beast. It's your entry into big beastdom, and it's a way of helping you get more senior positions in the future. So I expect quite a wide field on that business, on the leadership race. And I think the leadership race, the tone of the leadership race, the arguments that will be adopted will be very much on what Stephen has been talking about, on what is the future relationship of the UK with the EU, what is the model that we will go for. And I think there will be subtle differences between all the different candidates, which I will come on to. But I think that will be very much the focus of the debate in the leadership race. I mean, there's lots of talk about whether, you know, I noticed yesterday in the papers about whether Article 50 will really be enacted, whether there'll be a second referendum, whether there'll be a general election called when a new Prime Minister is appointed by the Tory parties. And of course you've seen people like the Lib Dems, for example, saying that in the next election they'll campaign to stay in the EU, so before we get out, you know, if there's a general election, the Lib Dems may pick up support there, which I think is a clever move. But I think the Tories as a whole, whether they're Leave or Remainers, accept that the British people have spoken, democracy has spoken, and that we will have to leave the EU. So as much as it's kind of, you know, the economy will go down the tank, therefore no one will trigger Article 50, or we'll have to have another election and that will stop us getting out of the EU. I think most Tories are united in their belief that we have to leave the EU, and there has to be a deal on that basis, rather than trying to stop what democracy has instructed. So now going into sort of the Brexit camp, who are getting behind Boris, and obviously Boris is the front runner, and will announce his leadership bid soon. He's got Gove. There's been a big offer to Osborne, and I think what you will find with that camp, who have led the Vote Leave camp, that they'll try and differentiate themselves from Farage in the months ahead. That, you know, they're very internationalist, they're very pro-migration, they're very European, they're business-minded. For them it was about sovereignty, it wasn't about inward-looking, being anti-migration. And I think you know, the political incentives are very much for them to do that and to be much more pro-migration, internationalist, looking out to the world. And I think you know, you're already seeing that from from Boris Johnson in the Telegraph today. And indeed there was a kind of tone in Johnson's article which was very much Cameron 2.0. He talked about the need to kind of do the Life Chancellor strategy, to be sort of one nation, be modernising. You know, for Boris, he's ticked the right-wing box by leading the Eurosceptic charge. Now he needs to show he's in the modernising camp, and I expect that those people who've been leading Brexit will try and position themselves very much where Cameron has. And in terms of Team Cameron, you know, the PM's resignation I thought was the right thing to do. He's accepted loss. He didn't want to lead something, the renegotiation, which he didn't believe in. Somebody else should do that who believes in it. And also it's about his legacy in the sense of, you know, there's so much poison in the Labour Party around Blair and Blairism and Blair's legacy. I think Cameron stepping down